It is said by some that there are two kinds of knowledge. The more common, basic sort is relatively harmless. In learning this sort of knowledge, you merely change what you know. There are deeper truths, however, which leave a more profound impression upon a person. In learning such truths, you change something of who you are. I had been suspicious of this classification until recently. It has been nearly 6 months since Charlotte and I left the Tulgey Wood. Neither of us has felt inclined to return, all things considered, though I can tell that she misses the place. It's the only home she's ever known, though I have done all I could to make my own home as comfortable as possible. She had nowhere else to stay, and I owe her a great deal. After all, the samples she helped me to retrieve from that eldritch place have proven remarkably profitable. Winter has come and gone, and warmer weather has left both of us somewhat restless, but there may be a remedy for this. One result of our ventures in the Tulgey Wood was the retrieval of a rather disturbing journal. We were able to find the owner of this journal and return it to them. This has left us in good standing with this influential individual. Somewhat to my surprise, I received a letter just this afternoon. Apparently, a new liminal biome has been discovered, roughly 4 months ago. At the time of this discovery, access was limited by the unfavorable season. Now, as spring tilts towards summer, a proper expedition is being prepared, and we have apparently been invited to join this merry little band. A liminal biome is roughly defined as the biotic and abiotic factors found within a stable expanse of warped space contained between two disparate realities. Each of these unusual places is a realm between the realms, defined by the dimensions and its boundaries. It is possible to cross into these liminal places through a number of thresholds, though the details of these junctions vary with each biome. Some of the liminal biomes have had human settlements for thousands of years, while others have remained hidden from human knowledge until only recently. One of the newest biomes to be discovered is technically listed as liminal biome E47. More informally, it has been referred to by initial researchers as the Labyrinth Coast. In actuality, the environment appears to be more akin to an extended salt marsh filled with unusual geological formations. These convoluted forms have a somewhat organic appearance, though a properly thorough analysis is still pending. Life seems abundant at the threshold at least, though the forms are diminutive and relatively simple. Scrying devices detected something resembling an ocean approximately 50 miles inward from the mundane threshold. There may be a span of open shoreline beyond the stone labyrinth, but preliminary readings are as yet confused. A formal expedition is scheduled to enter this biome in a matter of days. The ultimate goal will be to reach this theoretical ocean, though they are likely to take a circuitous route, spending several days investigating the labyrinthine expanse. I write this entry at the threshold of the liminal, gazing through the mist as our crew undergoes their final preparations. It was a long journey through the desolate, empty country before we reached what amounts to an improvised outpost. Having stayed the night, we intend to enter at sunrise, or shortly thereafter. Somewhat to my chagrin, I will not be able to indulge my usual habit of illustration while we explore the biome. The limited accounts from preliminary investigations show a remarkably high level of humidity, sufficient to reduce conventional paper to mush within a matter of days if not hours. There is the option of specially treated paper and ink, which is sufficient for simple written entries. However, the medium does not lend itself to the subtleties of even basic sketchwork. Despite this regrettable state of affairs, there is an upside to this particular expedition at least. A new liminal biome draws the attention of some fairly deep pockets, so I have been provided with a rather sophisticated portable photoeidetic device, myself and 2 others in our band of 7. I would mention something of the 5 beyond Charlotte and myself, but anonymity was one of the conditions for our joining this venture. It is just as well that I haven't disclosed my identity in any prior entries, and Charlotte is technically using a pseudonym. Initial analysis of the Labyrinth Coast liminal biome as of 23rd of May, Standard Calendar. Approximate midday temperature 21 degrees centigrade. Approximate midnight temperature 14 degrees centigrade. Relative humidity 90 to 95%. Atmospheric pressure roughly 1.1 atmospheres. The labyrinthine expanse consists of irregular stone structures arising from limestone bedrock with a thin layer of alluvial deposits. The stone structures are almost universally surmounted by layers of greenish material which may or may not be integral components. Pools of standing saltwater are commonplace, and life is abundant. Autotrophic forms appear to be algal lineages, with the possibility of salt-tolerant bryophytes as well. These are found atop the stone forms and within the saltwater pools. Initial chemical testing suggests cyanobacteria, at least in part. Animal life may be broadly categorized into 3 functional groups, though revision will be necessary when further information becomes available. The first group is the sessile forms, some of which may be found to be fungal or algal rather than animal. General appearances suggest Cnidarian taxonomy, though porifera and echinodermata are also distinct possibilities. The second group is the crawling forms, informally referred to as scuttlers by the expedition team. While bilateral symmetry is commonplace, there appears to be no clear distinction between vertebrate and invertebrate morphologies. Fish, crustacean, and cephalopod analogues are the most commonplace upon initial inspection. The third group is the floating forms, informally referred to as drifters by the expedition team. As with the scuttlers, bilateral symmetry appears to be the norm, and there is a similar blending of vertebrate and invertebrate forms. However, the nearest analogues appear to be versions of Cnidarian, siphonophore, and isopod based upon available data. All animal life is as yet relatively diminutive, though there are accounts of larger forms located further inward from the threshold. Classification will almost certainly require revision should these larger forms be verified. It is early afternoon, and we have well and truly left the mundane realm behind. The humidity in this place was not exaggerated. The landscape is veiled in a haze of cold mist sufficient to obscure details even a short distance away. There is a maritime scent to the air, as one might encounter on a beach at low tide, a somewhat unpleasant amalgam of salt and subtle decay. What stands out most immediately is the labyrinthine nature of the terrain. We are surrounded on all sides by towering sculptures of strangely flowing stone, often capped with a thin layer of what appears to be moss of some kind. I suspect that the formations are not strictly geological, regardless of their apparent composition. There are vague suggestions of coral among the forms, though conventional coral formations would be far more intricate. There are pools of fairly stagnant water in the lowest places, and even above the water the ground is distinctly damp. There are just enough stones about to make the terrain difficult to walk over without paying close attention to one's feet. Small invertebrates appear to be quite commonplace, falling into 3 basic categories. There are the sessile organisms attached to the stone formations, the scuttling creatures that creep and climb, and the floating forms that seem to have an unusual buoyancy keeping them aloft somehow. The overall impression is reminiscent of what one might see in a tide pool, though these creatures are above the water. There is little in the way of larger, complex animal life visible as yet, though we have only traveled a short distance from the threshold. I'm only able to take the time to write this entry because the others are busily scouting out potential paths through this maze. The stone formations may be more accurately described as stone trees, though this is an analogous designation rather than a homologous one. The nearest equivalent in mundane space would appear to be stromatolites, the colonial layered growths of primitive cyanobacteria. However, this is a misleading comparison, as the forms within the labyrinth are far larger and more complicated. To refer to one of these structures as a stromatolite would be akin to referring to an oak tree as a clump of peat moss. Night has fallen, and the place has taken on a somewhat more ominous air. Somewhere nearby, one of the larger scuttlers is bellowing with an odd rhythm. I caught a glimpse of such a creature earlier. Its sonorous baritone was sufficient to cast a fine haze of water droplets over its immediate surroundings. Some have tried speculating a bit as to the purpose of such songs, but there are no conclusions as yet. Not nearly enough information thus far. We have been moving towards the sea, presumably, though it is difficult to maintain a sense of direction in this place. It is also difficult to escape the omnipresent dampness. The air itself feels heavier now, as though one might require gills rather than lungs for proper breathing. That being said, breathing doesn't feel at all difficult. There is a richness to the atmosphere. Our resident geochemist has theorized that the oxygen content is heightened in this biome, and I am inclined to agree. If this is true, there are potentially worrisome implications. To my understanding, the heightened oxygenation during the Carboniferous era of prehistory allowed for the development of remarkable body sizes in arthropod life. There are signs that something similar may be happening here. The resident animals have become steadily larger as we've pressed deeper into the biome. If we assume a linear rate of expansion, I suspect we will be in the presence of giants by the time we reach the sea. Depending upon the disposition of such creatures, I wonder if we will reach the ocean at all. For reasons that are as yet unclear, the atmospheric oxygen content is significantly higher than that of the mundane baseline. The implication would be a considerable photosynthetic efficiency in the stone trees. However, it is possible that the animal life incorporates autotrophic symbionts as well. Alternatively, the as yet unseen ocean may contain the main focus of oxygen production. A sufficient density of phytoplankton might easily account for at least a portion of this atmospheric enrichment. I was awakened this morning by one of the scuttlers nibbling at the edge of my shirt. It was a cheeky little rascal that seemed inclined to pose for me as I sought to capture its image. We've traveled a far distance since then, and evening is approaching swiftly now. Currently, our scouts are seeking out a viable campsite. Most likely, we will endeavor to sleep on one of the higher ledges well above the waterline. This may not be as daunting as it sounds, as we've all felt a distinct lightness in our steps of late. The stone trees, as we've taken to calling them, have grown larger and more fantastical in shape, and the resident animal life has become considerably larger overall. Even the so-called drifters have reached the size of a person's hand, at the larger end of the scale. Preliminary conclusions suggest both an increased oxygen level and a decreased gravitational field. If so, this would make this biome one of only a handful with significantly modified gravitation. As the expedition proceeds towards the biome interior, the average body size of the resident animal life has been steadily increasing. Smaller forms are still abundant, but the larger forms are certainly more prominent. While no dissections have been undertaken as yet, there have been ample opportunities for close study. Most of the varieties appear entirely unbothered by human proximity. They may be altogether oblivious or simply disinterested. Bilateral symmetry continues to be the norm, often with prominent eyes for seeing in the low-light conditions below the stone trees. The air has grown heavier as well, and dense fog is a common phenomenon. Thus, the overall light levels are lowered still further. Scuttler body plans are largely comparable to isopod, amphipod, and decapod forms of crustacean life overall, with variance in the finer details. The heads often have vertebrate features, particularly reminiscent of certain types of fish. The body appendages may be segmented, but tentacle forms are not uncommon. That being said, such tentacles tend to follow the ophiuroid pattern more often than the cephalopod pattern. Or to put it in more common parlance, when these scuttlers have tentacles, they tend to be like the skeletal arms of brittle stars more than the soft arms of squid or cuttlefish. General behaviors observed thus far suggest opportunistic scavengers with decidedly omnivorous tendencies. They may graze on the algal mats, but they will just as readily snap up smaller scuttlers that wander within range. However, they do not seem to actively pursue prey. That said, their metabolism must be quite high, as they all appear to have quite ravenous appetites. Another morning with a curious encounter. This time it was a drifter floating quite close by. It regarded me with what seemed like genuine curiosity. When I procured a bit of hardtack from my supplies, this curiosity became distinctly more pointed. It nibbled appreciatively at the edge of the biscuit for a time before floating off into the tranquil morning air. Though its mouth didn't seem especially formidable, the humidity had rendered the hardtack into something much more like soft tack. The drifters are the most unconventional forms of life encountered thus far within the Labyrinth Coast. They appear to be equally at home in the air and in the water, and have been observed moving between the two mediums quite frequently. Further into the biome, the shallow pools have become deeper and more commonplace. This may be one reason for the larger forms of drifter more recently observed. However, the gravitational force appears to be steadily diminishing as well, and there are indications of steadily increasing oxygenation within the atmosphere. All of these factors would support larger body sizes in these airborne creatures. Most of the larger forms are relatively rounded, suggesting the presence of internal chambers filled with buoyant gases of an as yet unknown composition. As with the scuttlers, the drifters appear to be an amalgam of vertebrate and invertebrate lineages. However, their tissues are more translucent overall, evoking many of the gelatinous forms seen in the mundane oceans. That being said, there is still a clear bilateral symmetry, and sophisticated eyes and other sensory organs are readily apparent. The creatures move with definite purpose, albeit at a somewhat slow gait. Still, they can manage surprising turns of speed under certain circumstances. They also react quite rapidly to subtle environmental changes. An increase in wind velocity will result in most of the drifters immediately seeking water. If none is readily available, they will often move to cling to available surfaces on the stone trees. Anecdotally, both the drifters and the scuttlers appear to be relatively curious, at least where food is concerned. All motile animal life observed here thus far has been remarkably preoccupied with feeding and apparently willing to scavenge virtually anything that is available. Expedition members have had to keep a close eye on their provisions, as the more enterprising drifters have tried to gain access to luggage on several occasions. There is currently some speculation as to the maximum size of both the drifters and the scuttlers. Some within the expedition have theorized that scuttlers at least might grow to alarmingly large sizes deeper within the labyrinth. It is well after dark at the moment, and we're all somewhat on edge. Well, nearly all of us. Nearby, Charlotte seems to be sleeping quite contentedly. I suppose such an outre setting suits her tastes almost perfectly. For the less adventurous among us, sleep has proven more elusive as yet. I suspect the others have nodded off by now, but I've always been prone to insomnia, and recent events have not helped matters. Late this afternoon, our group happened upon an opening within the labyrinth. Not the proper seashore by any means, but a clearing of fairly appreciable size. The reason for the lack of stone trees is as yet undetermined, but there were several especially deep pools of water in the vicinity. Through the mist, we could see what appeared to be a large, oddly shaped rock formation in the midst of this open expanse. This impression was short-lived as the thing began to slowly move. Thankfully, it was not moving towards us, and it seemed placid enough in its demeanor, but this was still unsettling. Since that time, several of us have caught sight of the occasional large shape moving in the distance, almost altogether obscured by the mist. There have also been faint, deep vocalizations reminiscent of a whale's singing, though deeper and more sonorous. In some of the more extreme cases, we felt the vibrations rather than properly hearing them. Even now, as I try to sleep, I can feel the subtle tremors troubling the air and the stone beneath me. It is at once exciting and mortifying. We've been traveling for a few days now, and the labyrinth continues to grow more impressive and more imposing. It feels very different from the place we first entered. Different enough that our resident ecologist has proposed a subdivision of the biome. The environment we entered is tentatively known as the Near Labyrinth. Where we are now is the Middle Labyrinth. Depending on what we find, the deepest accessible region in the biome will likely be designated as the Far Labyrinth. I'm troubled by what that hypothetical Far Labyrinth might be like. As we travel, the gravity continues to fall, and the oxygen levels continue to rise. This has led to a few notable changes in our surroundings. The stone trees are more like towers now, growing to remarkable heights in some cases. Animal life is similarly impressive. The drifters have grown larger and more aggressive, but the most striking change has been in the scuttler population. Many of the scuttlers we encounter now are as large as us, or larger. If the trend continues, we will soon be dwarfed by these creatures. Given their ravenous appetites, this is not a pleasant thought. We have taken to discussing defensive plans should the need arise. All of us are armed in one fashion or another, as is appropriate for such an expedition. However, only a few of us have any real skill with weaponry. Some of us have taken to calling these larger scuttler species by a slightly different name. It began almost as a jest when one of our number casually referred to them as scuttlebeasts. The name seems to have stuck in place. It may be simplistic, but it does convey their nature with reasonable accuracy. In a more formal sense, the expedition leader has devised a different scientific name for these larger varieties. For now, at least, they are all to be grouped together within the genus Sclerobatrachus, which means armored toad. This is appropriate enough, as most do have a distinctly toad-like quality to them, and they are all armored to varying degrees. One of the more unusual scuttlebeasts in the Middle Labyrinth is the so-called leafy scuttlebeast. These creatures appear to cultivate colonies of leafy red algae on their carapaces. The reason for this is as yet unclear. It might be a food source or a defensive measure if the algae are at all toxic. There is also the possibility that these structures are not algal in nature, but rather a part of the creature itself. If so, they might be decoys of some kind, able to be torn away to allow the creature to escape predators. Alternatively, they might serve as gills or sensory organs. It is as yet impossible to determine the actual nature of these odd growths without capturing one of the creatures that carries them. Such a capture is unlikely given the rapid gait and skittish nature of these particular fauna. We have confirmed the presence of pack hunters among the scuttlebeasts. This discovery was less than pleasant. It began sometime after we'd made camp for the night when we heard a chorus of unusual sounds. These were mostly low clicks and hisses, with the occasional disturbing ululation. The source of these noises came into view not much later. Rather, I should say the sources, as at least half a dozen scuttlebeasts emerged from the shadows. They paused to observe our encampment for a few moments before the largest among them turned to scuttle off. The others quickly followed suit. It would have been troubling enough if that had been the end of it. A short while later, we were approached again from a different direction. It is likely that it was the same group, but we are as yet uncertain of this. This time, rather than simply departing, the creatures lingered a while to observe us in a most unsettling manner. They were distracted from this by the timely arrival of another relatively large scuttlebeast. They fell upon the creature with uncanny coordination. It was dead within minutes, and we watched as they fed ravenously on its remains. In less than half an hour, there was little left beyond a few shell fragments. Afterward, the fiends quietly slipped away into the darkness. We didn't see them again, but I think we all felt eyes on us for the rest of the night. As of this morning, our defensive plans have grown to include more robust and detailed night watches. The airborne drifters are plentiful in this region of the labyrinth, with relatively large and sometimes elaborate forms. They appear to form a significant portion of the diet for the average scuttlebeast. In answer to this predation, different species have developed various defenses. Broadly speaking, these defenses appear to fall within three general categories. The most obvious of these would be the armored drifters. These creatures are relatively small, as armor is not particularly conducive to flight. The armor is not entirely effective, as a few of the bulkier beasts have been observed consuming these creatures with little issue. A fair number of indigestible shell fragments are scattered about this environment, likely from a combination of drifters and scuttlebeasts. Some of the samples have a porous, trabecular quality reminiscent of the hollow bones seen in typical avians. One might surmise that these are from the drifters. The second observed form of defense is preternatural sensory acuity. These drifters have a particularly nervous habit and tend to flee at the slightest provocation. Their forms are relatively delicate, but strangely compact. The various sensory structures are easily and readily withdrawn and hesitantly extended once any perceived danger has passed. The third observed defense is particularly unusual and consists of the emission of a lucent cloud of minuscule droplets. This seems to serve a function similar to the ink ejected by certain cephalopoda. A sample of the substance was obtained with some difficulty. Apparently, it is quite irritating to the mucous membranes. There is a theoretical fourth defense of camouflage, but if it is present, it is apparently too effective for us to have noticed. Such measures seem unlikely, as there is little to masquerade as in the open air. Transparency might be possible, but among the larger drifters, such diaphanous forms seem to be altogether absent. There is another curious absence among the defenses. Speed and agility are commonplace among flying and swimming fauna within mundane space. Here, such phenomena seem restricted to the earthbound creatures. The average drifter mobility is underwhelming in comparison. Given the significant predation in this realm, the lack of such defenses presents a troubling enigma. Late this morning, we became aware of a worrisome sound. It seemed to be coming from ahead of us, though honestly its source was difficult to truly place. It was a low, deep, resonant sort of howl that seemed to shake the stone underfoot as it grew steadily louder. Charlotte was the first to note the sudden lack of drifters floating about. There wasn't a scuttlebeast in sight either. I noticed a curious aggregation of creatures on one side of the nearest of the stone trees. It took a moment to recognize them as various drifters, as they were anchored firmly onto the surface with whatever appendages they could utilize. When I pointed this out, it was the work of only a few seconds for us to put the pieces together. With terrified alacrity, we rushed to the largest of the nearby trees and settled in among the clinging life as best we could. It wasn't long afterward that the tempest descended. I could go on at length about the misery of the next few hours, sheltering as best we could out in the open. We were buffeted by scraps of detritus turned to dangerous projectiles, deafened by the omnipresent wind, and perpetually drenched by rain that was oddly salty. When it was finally over, we could do little apart from make camp and try to dry ourselves out. The omnipresent salinity of the water here might be a fair disinfectant for our waterlogged hides, but it does present a difficulty. We have only our rationed water to drink, as the brine here isn't suitable for human consumption. A couple of our more enterprising engineering types have tried to develop a portable distillation device. If these efforts should fail, we shall be compelled to turn back within a few days at most. At the very least, this tempest has eloquently demonstrated the reason for the apparent lack of particularly swift flyers among the drifter population. Any form capable of moving at speed through the air would likely be fairly lightweight and relatively fragile, with prominent wings of one sort or another. Such a shape might easily be torn to pieces in the local storms. Within the middle labyrinth, there is an unusual variant of scuttlebeast. Most of these creatures are relatively active and agile, much like the scuttlers seen in the near labyrinth. In contrast, these specimens are relatively slow, with a creeping gait. They have more appendages than their more active counterparts, though each of these is shorter on average. The current theory is that this is an adaptation to the inclement weather of this part of the biome. Such forms would not need to hurry to safety during an approaching storm, as they are perpetually anchored to at least some degree. The so-called creeping anchor strategy does present the problem of the lack of mobility. This interferes with acquiring food and avoiding predation. The answer to this issue is elegant and dangerous. Thus far, all creeping forms of scuttlebeast have been observed to have bold coloration, often some variant of red. It appears to be a form of aposematic marking, as it is accompanied by various sorts of venomous spines. At least some of the observed spines are retractable, while others appear to be fixed. Some, particularly those on the limbs, serve in prey capture and subdual. Others, mainly on the back, serve as deterrents against the larger predators. Given the abundance of spines, these creeping venomous things have the tentative genus name of Acanthobatrachus, roughly translating into spiny toad. Other candidate names include Erythrobatrachus and Toxobatrachus. Just when you think you have the sense of this place, something comes along to upend your misconceptions. Thus far, we've encountered three basic sorts of animal life: the scuttlers, the drifters, and the thankfully elusive titans. We still hear their vocalizations and catch the odd glimpse of them in the mist, but they're too large to walk between the stone trees. Not surprisingly, we've resolved to stay in the more confined spaces for safety's sake. It seems I've gone off on something of a tangent. Mental focus has been more difficult of late. Sleep has proven elusive for various reasons, but I fear the major cause is the changing atmosphere. There is a sort of giddiness seeping into our minds. I've seen it in the others and felt it myself. Maybe it's the rising oxygen or the increasing air pressure. Once again, my thoughts have wandered. 3 forms of life, if we consider the scuttlebeasts to be simply larger forms of scuttler. Not surprisingly, we'd settled into the assumption that these were the only forms of animal life in this place. Today, that idea has been quite thoroughly disproven. It began when Charlotte noted something odd about one of the stone trees. Really, it looked more like a stone shrub of sorts, rather squat and broad, not the graceful towering form we've grown accustomed to seeing. A closer look revealed an odd profusion of vines about its base. As we approached, much to our surprise, the stone form began to move. The vines were, in fact, ambulatory appendages. It is likely they are also sensory appendages, as we could discern nothing like a conventional head amid the writhing mass of limbs. Knowing what to look for, we were able to find a few more examples of these strange creatures throughout the afternoon. One in particular was quite large, with a stone form easily 3 times the height of an average person. Although the exact phylogeny of these creatures is as yet uncertain, we have started referring to them as shield crinoids. The shield crinoid is one of the more unconventional forms of life within the Labyrinth Coast. Its body is largely hidden beneath a stone shell of considerable size and thickness. The gravitational conditions allow for it to carry this large mass without being crushed in the process. The current theory is that these creatures cultivate colonies of native cyanobacteria on their backs from an early age. As the creature grows larger, the colonies develop into forms similar to the stone trees that form the basis of the labyrinth. Whether this serves as camouflage or armor, or both, is as yet uncertain. Beneath this cultivated shield, all that is visible of the crinoid is its many appendages. Counts estimate 30 overall, though a precise number is as yet elusive. These limbs can be readily withdrawn into the shell, and several appear to be withdrawn at any given moment. This is most likely due to the feeding behavior of the crinoid, as it is continually drawing in scraps of detritus. Like many of the conventional echinoderms, the shield crinoids apparently live as generalist scavengers. However, one particularly large specimen was observed taking a scuttlebeast of considerable size as prey. The unfortunate creature was snared in several of the coiling limbs and struggled for only a few moments before falling still. Thus, it would seem that these crinoids are venomous, and it is the current policy to observe them from a safe distance. Thankfully, they are not particularly swift. However, we have become more careful of the trees around us. It is entirely possible that at least some lineages of shield crinoid may act as ambush predators. Today we have slain a scuttlebeast. It was only a matter of time, I suppose. The thing was stalking us for several minutes before it decided to attack. Thankfully, Charlotte's hunting experience served her well, and she was able to fight the creature without any serious injury. I'd heard of the weapons of Tulgi residents, the vorpal blades the more adventurous sorts often carry. Charlotte was no exception, carrying something approximating a long, curved dagger. I've seen the blade on a few occasions now, but I had not seen her wield it before today. Apparently, it is considered bad luck to wield such a weapon carelessly or without need. I'm not certain whether it was connected with the oddly resonant hum that filled the air or the lambent glow that danced along the blade, but the reputation of vorpal weapons is well deserved. It cut through the beast with ease, carapace and all. Though Charlotte unquestionably led the charge in this fight, the rest of us pitched in as well. Collectively, we were able to bring the creature down quite rapidly. The rest of the evening has been spent in a combination of dissection and fighting off the local scavengers. That, or tossing them discarded parts to keep them busy. In the end, we've gathered a number of interesting samples from the remains. With such samples and the photoeidetic documentation, it has been decided that this creature will be the type species for the scuttlebeasts in general. We've decided to name it Charlotte's Scuttlebeast, somewhat to her surprise. She seemed fairly pleased in the end, once she managed to stop blushing and stammering. Victory is a heady tonic, but it can be a snare to the unwary. The labyrinth has proven to have a number of unexpected dangers. Perhaps the most pernicious of these is the environment itself. The omnipresent moisture is likely to foster skin infections and respiratory ailments over time. It is likely that the high salinity is the only thing staving off such pathogens for the time being. More worrisome is the oxygen content of the atmosphere. It is becoming dangerously high now. Fire is thankfully not much of a danger given the lack of dry material to burn. However, oxygen toxicity is a serious possibility. According to the preliminary mapping efforts, the shore is not far now. We have resolved to move deliberately towards it in the hopes of reaching it as quickly as possible. After one day, we will withdraw with all due haste. It is no great surprise that no human settlements have been found in this realm. It is not a place suitable for human habitation. The deeper we travel, the more apparent it becomes that we are interlopers, and we decidedly do not belong here. We continue onward into this waterlogged realm. My body feels remarkably light now with the lower gravity. That, or the slight delirium drifting about the edges of my mind. It feels as though we hardly need to breathe at all at this point. That is worrisome. Today we saw what looked like one of the wolf scuttlebeasts caught out on its own. Perhaps the rest of its pack had been eaten. If so, it joined them. The thing that devoured it was a larger one of its ilk. Not so much a wolf as perhaps a bear, or whatever answers for a bear in this twisted place. Happily enough, the thing seemed altogether uninterested in us. That is at least one small mercy. As we draw nearer to the shore, it seems as though fewer and fewer things find us at all appetizing. We are simply too small and perhaps too unfamiliar to be worth bothering over. I can only hope that we remain well beneath notice. The situation continues to deteriorate. There are troubling signs of low-level oxygen toxicity, though different expedition members are thus far affected to differing degrees. That said, it is only a matter of time before conditions become altogether debilitating. Oddly, the rising air pressure may conceal a second danger. There is the distinct possibility of nitrogen narcosis, though it is probable that oxygen toxicity will become significant well before this issue grows concerning. The presence of parasites has been confirmed within the Labyrinth Coast, at least by inference. One of the larger scuttlebeasts was observed engaged in a highly unusual behavior. The creature had climbed to the top of one of the smaller stone trees and was simply resting out in the open, its appendages slowly waving about. Its form appeared oddly bloated and listless, leaving its possible species altogether unrecognizable. It is likely that the creature was discolored as well, rendering proper identification all the more elusive. After several minutes of observation, the expedition had to withdraw. A Titan was approaching, and it has become standard policy to seek cover whenever this occurs. From a sheltered vantage point, it was possible to observe the bloated scuttlebeast being snapped up by the large predator. It offered no struggle and appeared almost eager to be devoured. Such is the grisly influence of what was most likely some form of internal parasite. Equivalent cases have been documented within mundane space, where a creature is manipulated to facilitate its own consumption, passing the parasite on to its next host. The labyrinth hardly feels like the same place now, despite the ongoing abundance of stone trees and bizarre monstrosities. At the outset, there was something almost charming about the place. Now, much of that charm has given way to a wary sense of otherworldliness. There have been odd changes in the vegetation. The greenery, such as it is, has been partially replaced with various rust-hued forms. Based on the samples taken, these seem to be a different form of algal life, likely more adapted to the different physical conditions. Perhaps they are dependent on high oxygen or high air pressure. In previously traveled regions, the creatures were all of similar sizes to one another. As we draw nearer to the shoreline, this uniformity has broken down. Now there seems to be a wide variety of forms and sizes hiding away from the various titans lurking at the labyrinth edges. Many of the local fauna now have the creeping venomous pattern of behavior. The frantic motion of the other regions has given way to an unsettling tranquility. What drifters still remain are remarkably furtive, never straying far out into the open sky, at least not for very long. At long last we caught our first glimpses of the open sea, though it was more a series of channels between distinct islands. Soon we will either see our way to more open water or else turn back out of sheer necessity. It can be confidently stated that the expedition has left the middle labyrinth and reached the far labyrinth. The region is dominated by remarkably large species, generally observed only at a distance, half concealed in the mist. There are a number of species that are dwarfed by these titans, though they are still considerably larger than the human scale. These forms of intermediate size almost universally exhibit a creeping modality and are adorned with venomous spines. The batrachian forms have largely given way to more serpentine morphologies, though perhaps vermiform would be more accurate as a description. There is also a growing abundance of smaller forms, though these appear to be different to the scuttlers encountered in the near labyrinth. After following the approximate coastline for several hours, we have reached what appears to be a vast expanse of open ground. It seems to be a mudflat of sorts, or whatever equivalent might exist in this realm. There are many pools of shallow water, and subtle ripple patterns suggest a regular inundation with high tides. It is impossible to guess at the size of this place, as any semblance of a horizon is altogether obscured by the heavy fog. There are a number of subtle signs of subterranean life here, such as clearly defined pores in the muddy surface or odd incongruities in the rippled patterning. There are even probable siphons that appear to be masquerading as a sparse alien flora. We haven't risked a venture out into this open ground, as it is highly probable that at least some of the unseen burrowers might easily regard us as potential food. This caution was soon justified when we observed a creeping scuttlebeast moving slowly along the edge of one of the rock formations. It was abruptly pulled beneath the mud, thrashing for only a moment before it was altogether lost from sight. We've been particularly fastidious about staying on stony ground since we saw this happen. As we made our way carefully along the edges of this foreboding expanse, we saw a titan slowly approaching through the mist. This creature was larger than any other thus far observed. As if to heighten the absurdity, the colossal monstrosity had a distinctly purple hue about it. Perhaps our senses of humor have become addled by the current atmosphere, but it was quickly named the Royal Behemoth, both for its size and its regal coloration. The Royal Behemoth appears to be a specialist adapted to live on the mudflats of the Labyrinth Coast. Its size suggests the scale of these flats must be considerable. The creature moves relatively slowly, with a size that puts it quite out of reach of any of the subterranean predators. In fact, it appears that these would-be predators are prey for the creature. Its front appendages are adapted for digging, while its mouth conceals a long, extensible tongue. The creature feeds by locating prey beneath the mud, digging it up with surprising rapidity, and using its tongue to draw it up into its mouth. Subsequent crunching noises suggest a formidable array of crushing teeth concealed within this mouth, though none have volunteered to verify this by direct observation. One mysterious aspect to the creature is the abundance of relatively small wavering tentacles on its back. These might be sensory organs or defensive structures of some sort. Alternatively, they may be some form of smaller commensal organism using the creature's back as a habitat. They might even be offspring in some early dependent stage. At last, we've gone as far as we could, finding our way out onto a rocky peninsula. Beyond, we could see a few scattered rock formations. Beyond those, only the ocean and the mist, a roiling expanse of shifting clouds. It seems that this ocean is a curious mixture of air and saltwater with a thriving population of phytoplankton. This might at least partially explain the ridiculously high oxygen concentration. From this promontory, the few stony cliffs we could see were adorned with especially rugged forms of rust-hued growth. There was a steady onshore wind, and so it looked almost as though we were falling into the clouds as the dense fog washed over us. It felt as if we were gazing into another world, and many of us suspect this place could well be near to the opposite boundary. If so, we haven't traveled to the halfway point, as is normally the case in liminal biomes. Rather, we have traversed the biome in its entirety, standing now on the threshold of the far reality. If this is indeed the case, then this other reality is far more compatible with our physiology than almost any other thus far described. As we stood, staring into the hazy abyss, we noticed the cloud formations beginning to move more rapidly. Chaotic whorls and eddies appeared, and the filtered daylight quickly began to dim. A storm was approaching, and we were caught with nowhere to flee to. Thus we hunkered down as best we could, pressing ourselves close into the irregular rock formations and tying ourselves down with what rope we'd brought. Somewhat to our relief, what happened next was not a tempest. The clouds were not being disturbed by an oncoming storm, but rather by an approaching monstrosity. It was a creature of such surpassing size it was more like a geological feature than an animal. A vast titan the size of a mountain hauled itself up onto one of the isolated rock formations. We could only watch as it lingered there, letting out a low, resonant bellow that shook reality itself. Then curious wisps of what looked like rose-hued vapor began to rise from its back. This apparent mist proved to be innumerable particles carried aloft in the strong wind. We watched as the trailing streaks sailed overhead, borne inland at remarkable speed. This lasted for only a minute or two. The bizarre emission slowly lessened before ceasing altogether. Then, as quickly as the creature had appeared, it turned and vanished once more into the clouded abyss. We have named it the Leviathan, though our focus has been more centered on what it might have spawned. Since departing the furthest promontory, we've moved inland as quickly as we dare. As of tonight, we are nearing the bounds of the middle labyrinth. It would seem that the current conception of the Labyrinth Coast ecosystem is in need of some degree of revision. There is little doubt among the expedition members that the Leviathan behavior observed was some form of spawning. The potential implications of this are considerable. Currently, it is the first priority of the expedition to return to the near labyrinth with as much speed as is safely feasible. To that end, the usual observation protocols have been suspended until further notice. It has been quite the forced march today. In just a single day we've traversed the middle labyrinth and are at the edges of the near labyrinth. The place is much as we remember, apart from one single significant difference. There is an abundance of small, frantic creatures the size of large insects. Each has a familiar, vaguely rosy hue about it. Beyond this, their forms are surprisingly variable, with differing numbers of limbs and styles of movement. More interestingly, this abundance is rapidly diminishing. Virtually everything else is eating these diminutive things with considerable enthusiasm. Those that survive this predation are without exception moving hastily inland. The current theory is that these tiny creatures will be more or less safe just at the threshold of our reality. In that place, the gravity is so high and the oxygen so low that the larger creatures simply cannot function well enough to pose much of a threat. From there, as they grow, these little creatures will slowly move back towards the ocean. Along the way, they will occupy regions balanced between predation pressure on the one hand and abiotic factors on the other. Too far inland, and the physical conditions of their surroundings interfere with their physiology. Too far seaward, and they are surrounded by predators considerably larger than themselves. This probable scenario gives rise to an inevitable question. How many of the described species on this expedition are actual species, and how many are simply larval or juvenile stages of much larger creatures? As the expedition draws to a close, at the threshold where it began, there is a noteworthy change in the environment. A renewed abundance of tiny scuttling forms. The diminutive creatures are feeding ravenously on the local vegetation and anything else they can find. This includes each other. A few have already been observed molting into larger creatures with forms remarkably different to those of their predecessors. Several of these new arrivals have been captured and preserved for genetic analysis. The wealth of samples collected over the course of the expedition will be studied closely for quite some time before any final conclusions are reached. It is good to be back home. It is perhaps even better to feel dryness on my skin. We were all in pretty rough shape by the end of that expedition. Even Charlotte, despite her adventurous personality, seemed altogether ready to be done with the place. Still, it has been most interesting to read the correspondence from our colleagues. It would appear that roughly 70% of the animal samples we collected proved to come from only 5 distinct genetic species. Of these, a full third are from the Leviathan species, matched to the creatures collected at the end of the expedition. It would seem that the Labyrinth Coast is, more than anything else, a sort of nursery for some of the larger fauna of the adjoining reality. At the very least, this much has been verified for the Leviathan. Interestingly enough, there has been some talk of renaming the Leviathan. The common name of Echidna has been suggested, as it seems to be a mother to myriad forms of monster. I shall leave that to the self-proclaimed experts in such matters. Another amusing piece of proposed nomenclature concerns the realm itself. It will likely retain the name of the Labyrinth Coast for the immediate future at least. However, the dimension it adjoins at its far end has been given the tentative name of Niflheim. This is derived from one of the realms described in Norse mythology, sometimes said to be a primal sort of place veiled in mist and teeming with monsters. Not a bad fit as names go. Still, the final decision on such matters doesn't rest with me. In the end, I was merely a part of the expedition, along for the ride, as it were. That said, I can't really complain. I've been well paid and gained a number of useful acquaintances and connections within the field of liminal biome exploration. This is just as well, as I will most likely be compelled to go on another expedition before too much time has passed. Charlotte is resting for the time being and quite content to relax about the house. However, if I know her even half as well as I suspect, it will take only a month or two for that serenity to fade away. Then we will be off on another venture of one sort or another into the next liminal realm in search of suitable distraction. I can only hope that wherever we travel to, it might be somewhat less taxing than the Labyrinth Coast expedition proved to be.